Chris Urbano is with the contracting office, and Jim Childers also
Grants and contracts.
grants and contracts at the Georgia Tech Research Corporation. And we've had internal discussions at IBB for a couple of years about how we're handling industry requests for access to core facilities, and we've really not been had a process for handling that, and we're getting to a point where, because of some of the contracts that are available, the template contracts, we think we can handle it, but we're not getting into issues of pricing and how we price contracts. So with all the questions that have been going back and forth with Chris and Jim, we asked them to come out today to give us a presentation on this so that we can sort of see the process ourselves with the contracts and really ask questions. So they're both here today, so do not be shy to ask questions, because we could really probably get a productive conversation going. So, Chris, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine. This is the first time I've given this class, so I wasn't really sure what all would be of interest. So I thought I would just kind of show the differences between research agreements and services agreements. I've been with Georgia Tech 17 years now. In the Office of Sponsored Programs, and have been doing industry contracting the whole time. It was right around the 1999, about 2000, that OSP kind of split off and created a separate industry contracting office to specialize in working with companies, because we're primarily a government contractor, as you all know. And the contracts folks in our office, that's their area of expertise. So through the years, we've done a lot of trial and error, and our research agreement and our service agreement templates are a result of that trial and error, and also because of our status. We are officially or legally a nonprofit institution and a state university. As Catherine had mentioned, we contract as the Georgia Tech Research Corporation on behalf of the campus. So all of our agreements reflect that. It gets a little confusing with companies because they come here to Georgia Tech and they're used to working just with the university. So the Research Corporation can kind of throw them, but we tend to get past that fairly quickly.
Question. I've run into that with companies. Do you have an explanation we could just show companies when they set up?
So our research agreement does have a little paragraph in it that says, and it was a description that was created by Legal Affairs. I don't know how enlightening it is, but basically, technically, we are a cooperative organization of the Georgia Institute of Technology, which I think is a fancy way of saying we are the contracting entity. And it's all. I mean, the Research Corporation is, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it's not a physical entity. It's just a paper entity. I sign contracts on behalf of GTRC, but I'm a university employee like y'all, as we all are, that are affiliated with the Research Corporation. So it's just a transparent relationship. It's just a name only, really, for legal and financial purposes. So it's not uncommon. There are other universities in the U.S. that have a similar setup. A lot of them use a foundation to do their contracting. But there are a couple that have a corporation by name that they contract through. So first we'll start off with research agreements. Because we are obviously a research university, R&D is our typical relationship with companies. And because we use research agreements, it's due to the fact that there's an expectation of creation of intellectual property. When I first came here years back, IP was kind of a notion that was out there, but few people had an understanding of it. And we actually used to give it away. If a company wanted it, we would just write it in the agreement. And then through the years, probably because of the IRS, we've changed that stance, and our agreement reflects that now. We never give it away. So usually the process starts either with the company or with the researcher. The company has an idea, comes to the university, and may know through networking a researcher here that is in that area. Or maybe the faculty member has an idea and through networking knows that a company is interested in this area. And so they'll get together and kind of discuss the idea further, refine the scope of work, and agree on a total cost and a schedule. Typically for us, our projects are between $50,000 and $100,000 and usually last about a year. Obviously we have a lot in excess of that, but that's our typical. And that's usually, I think, the cost of a GRA for a year and a faculty member's oversight time plus some M&S and travel and our indirect rates. So once that meeting has occurred and these items have been agreed to, the next step is to formalize the relationship, and then that's usually when ICO, or the industry contracting office that I'm from, that's when we get involved. So and doing industry contracting is the same as doing government contracting from an internal paperwork standpoint. We still require the proposal writing form, some kind of statement of work, and a detailed budget. And we'll review the statement of work to confirm that it's truly research being done so that we use the proper agreement. And I made a mistake on that. I'm sorry, that should be the research agreement template. And the other thing we look at is to see if it's intended that the project be cost reimbursement or fixed price. And I go into a little discussion about later on about the differences of those two. So, as I said, through some trial and error, we've created this research agreement template, and I have a copy I'm going to show you in a minute of what it looks like. So it complies with the IRS regulations about how universities conduct research. We are required to retain title to the IP, and we must have this IP available to outside parties to get access to, and we must be able to publish the results. Those are key, and those are obviously the main areas that we have discussions with companies on, and biggest areas of contention. And if the company objects to any one of those, we'll walk away.
Chris, I remember any of them areas. This, of course, the biggest thing is to retain title to IP. How and why does the IRS get involved in this question? What's wrong with a company coming out and saying, here's the cash, here's the contract, but we, the company, want to retain IP for whatever reason. Georgia Tech says you pay extra, let's say.
Right.
Is that illegal?
Well, the thing with the IRS, and I wasn't trying to get too deep into that because it's kind of a complex situation, but the IRS requires us to retain title to IP when research is being performed in a building that was constructed using tax-free bonds. It specifically stipulates that.
Okay.
The majority of the buildings on campus are in that status. Okay, so because you're using tax-free bonds, the work you're doing is supposed to be for public benefit. So if you give an IP to the company, then the company has total control over it. Nobody else gets to it, and the company benefits, and not the general public. So that's the main issue.
Wow, because in combination with the second line here, that would not allow Georgia Tech to give an exclusive license to that company. That's almost a killer to a lot of those companies.
So there is the ability for us to do exclusive licensing. Doesn't stipulate that it's allowed by the IRS, but it is allowed. It's a practice that's been going on for years. And that's the one benefit that we do give the company. So because you're paying for the research, you get the first shot at licensing it exclusively. You lock out your competitors, and there's a royalty involved in that too, so they don't get it for free. One of the big things that they do say when they come in and talk about IP is that, well, we're paying for the research, so we should own the IP. Well, you're paying for the research, you're not paying for the IP.
Right.
There's no guarantee IP is going to be created, and in fact, 80% of the time it doesn't happen. And I'm sure you all seen that for yourselves. So as a result, if they get the exclusive license option, then that's usually satisfactory. Okay. So our IP terms in our research agreement, it states that Georgia Tech owns what it discovers, the company owns the IP they discover during the project, and then we jointly own IP that we jointly created together. And then any background IP that either party brings into it is not affected by the agreement. So either party gives up their ownership of their background IP just by signing this contract. So there's a protection level that's very important to companies, obviously, because they don't want to come here and then give away their IP that they developed independently. And this concept tracks with U.S. patent law also, so a lot of companies are familiar with this position. So when we give the company an option to license, exclusively license the intellectual property that Georgia Tech develops, we do it so that it's limited to a specific period of time, but it's not, the licensing terms are not incorporated in the research agreement. We keep those two documents separate. That keeps the research agreement from getting too complex, but also because the IP hasn't even been created yet, you can't really come up with good licensing terms to match the technology you've created. So we keep that outside of the research agreement. So as I mentioned, we give them an option to an exclusive license to what we've created and then our half of the joint. Because with joint IP, both parties have an undivided and equal ownership in it. And patent law says that each party can do whatever they want with that jointly owned IP. So we could, in essence, license our half of the IP to a competitor of the company. And not have to account to the company, get their permission, or even share in any revenue we create as a result of that license. So, again, that's a concern to the companies, and so we have in our language stating that, so, okay, you can again lock up this IP if you exclusively license our half of the joint IP, and that's usually what happens. So if they're exclusively licensing IP, they want all of it, and our licenses usually reflect that. So the option period is for a limited period of time, too. We don't want to give them forever to decide if they want to exclusively license, because that could drag on for years, and on purpose. If they have an open-ended option period, they, in essence, lock out any competitors. So our typical period is about 6 months. We can go longer. We've gone shorter. And at the end of that expiration, Georgia Tech, we're usually able to then license it to a third party and not account to the sponsor. Yes, sir.
Chris, the negotiation for the exclusive license, now, is that done up front, or is it done at this point after the development of some specific IP?
So licensing negotiations are done once the IP has been discovered and disclosed to the company. So there's another process involved in that, but basically when the researchers create IP, we have an Office of Technology Licensing that we're actually co-located with in our office. They're responsible for managing Georgia Tech's IP portfolio and for negotiating licenses with companies for that IP.
So it's done at a point after the development?
Yes, once it's been discovered, and the company decides after they've reviewed the disclosure and they decide there's value here, then yes, they'll sit down. So, it could be 6 months after the contract is signed, or it could be 2 years after the contract is signed.
And the general framework of all of this is consistent for most universities in the United States?
Correct. At least most major research universities. Right.
So, question.
Yes.
I'll wear my previous industrial hat. I know we would always control patent filing, patent prosecution, and have some limits and bounds on potential economic royalty rates before we sign anything. I assume Tech will do that same thing?
Yes, so we don't have a problem with the companies taking the lead on patenting. In fact, we like it because, as you know, the patent expenses can be pretty high, and we have a limited budget to cover. Because a typical application is between $10,000 and $20,000 just in the U.S. So if the company's willing to pay the patent expenses, we're willing to give them the right to take the lead on that whole process. One thing that we don't agree to is a royalty cap, or to establish a royalty in the research agreement. We put that off until we get the license, the actual exclusive license negotiated.
Any particular reason why?
Well, because it violates the IRS rule. There's another part of this IRS regulation that says you cannot predetermine the value of IP.
I would not disagree with that. I guess I've had direct experience in state universities where we've actually done things like have a range of royalties and that royalty rates set against competitive benchmarks, which are defined. That's been acceptable.
Yeah, so you can be creative in that area, and you know, given the right circumstances, we'll probably agree to something like that. But as just a matter of course, we shy away from any kind of limitation on the royalty. I mean, we know companies, the bottom line is what they're all about, and we understand that. And so it's a big step for them to contract with a university and not be able to get a determination on all of it, including the IP. But I think our track record with companies has proven that you know, we're very trustworthy. We're not out to extract as much as we can. To us, the research relationship is more important than any potential licensing that's out there. Yes, sir.
Is there ever any memorandum of understanding up front? I mean, just the ambiguity and uncertainty of dealing with the university from a commercial standpoint. You want some kind of balance.
So we rarely do MOUs. In essence, it's a glorified handshake because it's not a legal document.
Sure.
There's no teeth in it, right?
It gives a level of comfort.
It does. But for us, historically, especially with U.S. companies, we've never had to do MOUs. The only MOUs that I've done in the past 5 years have been with international companies. And I guess it's typical business for them, but from my experience, U.S. companies, we just go right into the contract. We don't mess with an MOU. So we don't really have a template for MOUs. That's because we just don't use them enough to warrant creating one. Because they could say anything you want them to say.
Right.
It doesn't really mean anything. Like I said, it's just a glorified handshake. So it's when you get to the research contract that you actually get some teeth in a legal document. Okay, so in our template, we also, in addition to an option for an exclusive license, we grant them an internal use, non-exclusive, royalty-free license, so that they're able to play with the technology themselves, and but not have to pay us for it. As long as they don't commercialize it, we don't have a problem with them using it. And publications, so we never agree to language that allows the company to approve a publication. All we do is we will grant them a period of time with which to review the publication before it's officially released. And this is to allow them to ensure that we're not releasing any proprietary information, or they may see some promising technology within that publication that they may want to patent. So we'll give them between 30 and 60 days to do the review. We will delete the proprietary information, and the company can request an additional 30 to 60 days delay in that so that we can proceed with patent protection if it's required.
If they want something patented that's come out of the research, would Georgia Tech ever say, no, we're not interested, and hand it off to them to do themselves, or would Georgia Tech always be the one to patent it and then follow through with the rest of how the terms work?
So my experience has been that every researcher thinks that their technology is the world beater. So if the company identifies IP and they want to proceed with the patent, we're going to jump on board and say, okay,
And
let's
they'll
do
pay.
And yeah,
The patent.
especially if they're going to pay and control the process. So as far as I know, we've never said, nah, we're not interested, you go on without us.
So
No.
that would always be pursued, the filings and stuff would be pursued at Georgia Tech instead of releasing it to the inventor or whoever.
So we do our own filing also. We do the technology licensing group gets involved in the process, but they actually hire out an outside patent attorney to do that formal process. And they have a kitty to draw on to pay those expenses, but primarily we try to get the sponsoring company to pay for it. If the sponsoring company is not interested in the IP and the PI says, no, this is really good stuff, and they convince technology licensing, then they'll go out and try and market it to another company. So I think our intention is we'll always try and patent anything, especially if we feel that there's value to it, even if one company doesn't. So we hope to find somebody else who would be interested in it. And if they are, then we'll get them to pay the patent expenses and proceed with the license.
But the key is they don't ever say, oh, here, you take it, you file it, and you own it.
Yeah.
Ownership has to stay with Georgia.
Right, that's correct. We always retain ownership of our solely developed IP. Yes, ma'am.
So if a company pays for sponsored research to develop a research tool, screening, instrumentation, or some kind of a research tool, they're done then. There's no, they can take it internally and use it indefinitely for their drug discovery process.
Yeah, so because they paid for the development, for the research that created this tool, and if the tool is a deliverable, and that kind of gets into our services discussion a little bit too. The difference between research and services is that the services, there is a guaranteed something at the end, whether it's data or maybe it's an algorithm, but there's some kind of deliverable that we give to the company for their use. That's the one time we actually do work for hire, for lack of a better term. But we do so little of it that it stays under the IRS radar when you compare it to the amount of research that we do. So there's some allowance there by the IRS to do some work for hire.
So if they sponsored research that developed a drug screening instrumentation, and it wasn't a deliverable, but it got published, and so now people could reproduce it, they would have a license-free royalty to that indefinitely.
Well, since it becomes part of the public domain, then the non-exclusive royalty-free thing is useless. Then everybody gets it for free.
Well, but they could have licensed to someone else, or it could
No,
be
'cause it's
still IP protected, that they wouldn't have to pay anything to access the IP around that instrument. They would always have access, because it's for research tool only internally.
I guess what she's talking about too is Georgia Tech owns half the company, owns half of the company, just wants to use it, doesn't care if anybody else uses it, then Georgia Tech can license their half to whoever.
Are you talking about
Right,
joint?
so-
Other companies.
Okay, that's
So-
true.
So there's IP created about this new instrument. Well, we can go over it. It's just, when you talk about developing research tools, then the company that pays for that can use it without licensing the IP.
So because it's a research tool, it doesn't necessarily mean it's patentable. And that's kind of where we make a distinction in licensing. We only license patentable technology.
But even if it is patentable, that company that sponsors the research doesn't have to pay Don for it, because they're going to use it for additional research anyway.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Just for but then we can license it obviously exclusively to somebody else and get a royalty out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of interest. So let's say Georgia Tech owns 50%, goes out, gets a license, royalty-bearing license. Would you have to share the royalty with something?
No. No, we don't have to share anything
Because
unless it's
then
stipulated.
from that other company's point of view, you'd rather want to buy into sort of a half share, or from Georgia Tech's point of view, that would be the ideal situation because you can still get the full royalty from the other company.
Yes. I mean, it's a win-win for us in a way because if they choose not to exclusively license our half of the joint IP, then, yeah, we can go and get a royalty-bearing non-exclusive with somebody else. Or maybe they want to do exclusive license, in which case we still get a royalty and we get it from the sponsoring company.
And that's the single point that drives most companies away,
Yeah.
is I'm going to pay for the research. I understand I own my half. I understand I own 100%, you own 100%. We're free to do what we want. But what I'm doing is creating an environment where I'm enabling my competition.
Yeah.
And so therefore, the only way to protect that is for a company in a research agreement to have an exclusive right up front, which with bounds on the cost for that licensing, which we're not inclined to do. So that's where it becomes problematic.
Okay?
So in these cases, Does Georgia Tech only use biomedical work? Done anything where there might be an embedded laboratory of, let's say, a pharmaceutical or medical device company on campus working side by side together with campus researchers?
So there's, to my knowledge, not a biomedical company doing it, but we do have a couple of electronics companies that are doing that.
So do you have a free flow then of the IP between the entities? Because it becomes fairly arbitrary when you try to draw the line.
Well, we still require that the line be there. So we do have a company over in P Square that has a laboratory kind of co-located with Georgia Tech laboratories over there. And we have a research contract in place with that company to do directed research, and then they're doing their own research separately. So the reality is that IP that comes out, more likely than not, will be jointly owned, jointly developed IP. But if they cross the hall into the Georgia Tech laboratory and IP is created, then that's part of we consider it as part of the research project, and therefore we own half of it. And if they want to lock it up, they got to license our half of the IP. So I'm sure that there could be an issue where the guy comes over, does the research, goes back into his own facility, does research there, and then declares an invention over there. There's not much we can do about that.
But you're making a distinction then as to where the physical work is done. And I guess I'm viewing it as a more true embedded laboratory where there isn't a physical distinction anymore. It might be the floor of the building, right? And part of it's Georgia Tech, part of it's whoever's paying the bills, right? But they have scientists of equal stature that are co-located, working in a true collaboration.
Sure.
The best way to deal with that effectively is to use a technology control plan like you would be if you're using a government contract. And within the technology control plan, you identify parameters, which information will flow and what the engineer's engagements will be, and with whom and in what environments. And you create information boxes. And then within that box, you just have to make sure that your staff understands the box and works within the box.
Right, but I'm not sure that if the boxes may make sense from a IP kind of perspective. I'm not sure they make sense from a project perspective in terms of, coming together to generate the most creative ideas to solve a given program or project.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there's two pieces to it. One is the IP, and then the other is the project. And the essence of all the IP and the inventorship is the creative element. And so within this process, you really have to define who are the creators of the intellectual property. And regardless of whether it happens on Georgia Tech property or not, if the industry guy is the inventor, then it's industry-owned, solely owned IP. If it's joint between them and Georgia Tech, then it's joint IP.
Yeah, except I guess I'm talking about the thing in which there's a true collaboration going on. So
Well, if it's true collaboration, then it's true joint
gonna be
IP.
joint,
It's joint
right.
IP, and there's no disagreement. But you have to define the boundaries of that project as part of the project description.
Well, it's in both parties' best interest to make sure that they declare it properly, because in patenting application that goes up to review, if there's not a truly inventive contribution by one or both parties, then you start having issues, right? So it needs to be clean from the start.
Chris, you mentioned templates a number of times. Is this something that we have access to see what that template is?
I have copies that I'm going to show you. We haven't really posted them to the OSP webpage yet. We're still kind of refining them a little bit, but I'm always happy to share. If somebody emails me or calls me and says they're meeting with the company and they'd like to, the company's requested the template, I'm more than happy to email it to you. Okay, so the services agreement. Any more questions on the research? Okay,
So
sure.
when you have the joint IP, then Georgia Tech can obviously go and license it if their share is not tied up in the company, and then the company can go with sub-licenses as well.
Mhm.
So there can be two licensing opportunities that people can choose to get to.
That's true. Yep.
Again, back to the framework that said, this is the framework that Georgia Tech would like to see. And it's driven partly by Bayh-Dole and partly by the IRS, right?
Well, Bayh-Dole only comes into effect when it's government money, but the IRS is the main driver
But
for our
the framework
perspective.
of this is, you're saying it's principally the IRS.
Correct.
Right? And this is a starting point or an ending point or an only point?
I wish it was to start in the end. The reality is that it's the starting point, but we don't veer too far. I mean, we have a little room to maneuver with the IP rights, but very little. And, you know, what we're seeing now is we kind of got creative a couple years ago with some PIs, and now they're having some problems working with competitors of these companies, which is good for the sponsoring company, but bad for the PI because it limits their ability to perform research freely. So we're trying to stick to the company line on all of our IP terms, so that in the end it gives the researchers more flexibility. That's our goal. I mean, we want to help the company, but obviously we're here to.
At the end of the day, it's a competitive environment. Companies have choices. Maybe not, they're not all as good, but
Right.
the one that the best competitor usually wins. Right? So there's some flexibility, you're saying, but not a lot.
Right, that's correct. We tailor most of our agreements to the company, but we don't veer too far away from our standard IP position.
With the new sort of Georgia Tech future vision that's being worked on, and there's been some things in there about allowing faculty maybe go out and work with companies for a certain amount of time and come back, and I know these are all ideas at the moment, not a finalized plan. Do you foresee any changes in contracting, or do you just see more changes in the university and how faculty work?
Yeah, I don't see our contracting changing very much because we're still constrained by IRS and Georgia state law and then federal law. Because we're a state university, we have to comply with Georgia law. There are some limitations there as to what we can agree to. So I think if there are any changes in policy or how we're going to interact with companies, I think from the GTRC perspective, it's not going to be very much of a big change. Of course, we're told when we're told to do something, we'll do it too, not violating the law. So that it's quite possible that our policies and procedures would shift also to coincide with this new direction the university wants to take. So that's going to be interesting. Okay, so services agreements. The main thing with services agreements is we enter into these relationships with the expectation that no IP will be created. Usually the purpose of the services agreement is to do some kind of testing or data analysis. And again, it's in this case, I guess it's primarily initiated by the company because they have a specific need and they know Georgia Tech has a specific expertise either with test equipment or some kind of testing process or just general expertise. So again, the process of getting a service agreement in place is the same as a research agreement. We still require a proposal writing form, statement of work, and a budget. And because we're not doing any unknown research, we're doing a very specific, limited project, then the dollar amounts tend to be a lot smaller and the periods of time are shorter. So we're looking at between $5,000 and $25,000 for about 6 months worth of work. So again, we've received the package, the routing sheet, statement of work, and budget. We'll review it, just confirm its services, and then we'll put together the service agreement template. And as you'll see soon, the template is small. The research agreement template's like 8 or 9 pages. The bulk of that is the IP section. The services agreement is only 3 pages. And it was done that way because, for one thing, most companies, when they're paying for services, will use a purchase order. because it's easy for them to get one processed. The last thing they want to see is a 9 to 10 page document just to get some testing done. So, I mean, we even reduced the font on this thing to make it real small, which matches their purchase order. So if you've seen a PO, right, you got to get a magnifying glass to look and see all that stuff. So this was our attempt to steer away from a purchase order because PO terms are very onerous for us as a university. If you've ever looked at one, they have typical commercial requirements. They own everything. We have to indemnify them for everything. We got to warrant what we do. All this kind of stuff we cannot do because we're a university, right? So the services agreement was used to kind of fool them into thinking this is kind of like a purchase order and should be easy to get through the review process.
Quick question about the money. Is 25K your maximum cap?
No. So that's typical. All right.
Okay.
So we have had services agreements in excess of 100,000, but that's foreseen as a long-term thing where the company had like a number of units they wanted us to test over a period of time, and we determined a price per unit kind of an approach. So there's no maximum or minimum for services agreement. It just has to do more with the IP or lack of IP.
Even though you're a 501c3, can you make a profit on this service activity?
Technically, no. We don't go into these with the hope of making a profit. It's not uncommon for us to have an underrun, what we call not a profit, but a cost underrun. And but we try and discourage that because you start getting that too much, the IRS can start looking at you as you're now working as a company. You're making money on these things when you're supposed to be breaking even. I mean, that's our goal when we go into any kind of contractual relationship with a company is just to break even. We just want to cover our costs. We don't want to lose money. And that's one thing I tell companies too is we're not for profit, but we're also not for loss. We're not going in this to where we have to use our own resources. We just want to cover our costs. But yeah, we don't want to make too much money. It does happen at times, but so does the overrun, though. There are times we go into these things and we lose $10,000, $20,000, $30,000.
So there's no financial incentive to establish a service agreement. The only incentive would be
just for, I guess, ease of use. Again, with the service agreement, there's no IP being anticipated, so we don't have to get involved in that long discussion about IP rights because there's not going to be any IP to.
for the academics incentive. Is this maybe a way of establishing a relationship with a company because of the academic, they're either building publications and IP or they're bringing in money for their lab. So I guess if they had some cost gap that this could cover, but that would be weird to switch your FTEs to some specific deliverable kind of project. I'm just trying to understand what the incentive is.
So your colleagues could tell you more than me. I mean, I don't know. All I know is a proposal shows up and they want to do some testing. This is what we really, that's what
I give you a good example. We've got a company, we've got a material or something that we've developed, and we own the intellectual property rights for it. The company XYZ says, hey, what we'd like you to do is actually build us a few prototypes to see how your material demonstrates in our environment, and if we and build it and test and characterize it, and then if we like the results, what we want to do is look to put in a 3-year contract to take and do some more research in this field. So that's a good lead-in environment for a service agreement.
You said things on the company purchase order are non-starters. If they sign a service agreement, they may issue a purchase order for their own internal purposes, but it's not something that you end up signing.
Right. So that's very common because in order for them to spend money, 9 times out of 10, they still have to issue a purchase order. Even on a research contract, they issue a purchase order. We've covered that because, like the last paragraph in both of our agreements basically says that this is the contractual document between the parties. Anything else, including a purchase order, is superseded by these terms. So purchase orders are only issued for payment purposes and not to govern the contractual relationship.
Okay.
The first bullet up there, as far as just what paperwork gets sent to you folks, we really don't need to mess with the contract itself. You just want to know what's the scope of work, what's the budget, and the routing sheet, and you'll determine which contract is best.
Usually.
Okay.
And we might confirm, I mean, there are some gray areas where it looks like it's more services in nature, but There could be a development component of it, and we may have to tweak and either use the research agreement then or add some research language into the services agreement, which we've done.
So in the services agreement, the data that comes out, is the ownership of that data unambiguous and clear?
Yeah, so we clearly state in the services agreement that the sponsor gets title. They get to own the test results or the data generated. That is what they're paying for. So in our purview, that's not intellectual property. That's not patentable technology. That's just results.
But it could very well be the basis of patent application.
It could.
Results.
It could.
Especially considering, I mean, one thing we have here is lots of unusually unique facilities. Some things are, usually in a confocal microscope. We also have some very unusual other things that there's few other people in the world that have, right? And I guess my question would be, is the value of that included in how we price these services?
Well, my experience has been that most of the researchers on campus want to please the company. And so when they're doing a services project, to me, my experience has been they're not necessarily hoping to find some IP, and they just want to do the project and give the results to the company. If there's IP in it, great, the company can have it. There are some, I think, who, if they see patentable technology in there, may withhold that from the final report and save it for another project. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but we've never, since I've been here, I've never seen IP come out of a services agreement final report that I've been made aware of.
So this kind of goes back to the statement of work. In a particular case, I think, using your example, if we're going to apply some standard measurement techniques and tools to provide data, in my mind, that would be a service agreement. However, if somebody said, I want to find a method for testing this, and then we're going to develop the technique to do that using standard tools that we have, or even some unique tools that we have, then that's a research agreement. Because there's the potential for new intellectual property developed on the front end.
So one thing, too, is that in our services agreement IP clause, the first sentence says, okay, you own the test results. However, if there's any patentable IP that comes out of this work, we still own it. So we have an ability to claim ownership of IP if it's discovered in the final report or the deliverable, whatever it is that's being provided, then we can claim ownership of and protect it.
If the deliverable is something under the data, so in your example, it's a prototype, do they own the prototype and do what they have freedom to operate to do with that prototype, or let's say some nanomaterials?
So if we do provide a prototype, which we do a little bit, not a whole lot of, then we give them internal use, unlimited use of the prototype. But if it's something that they want to move into production, then we have to shift to a licensing agreement. So we do proof of concept things at times, and if there is prototyping involved, a lot of times we won't do a services agreement, we'll do a research agreement, just to protect our rights. Because there is the opportunity then to take the prototype and commercialize it. And we can be cut out of that. We don't want to risk that. So really we go into relationships with the thought we're doing a research project, not a services. In fact, years back, we would, even in the services relationship, we would use the research contract. The services agreement came about as a result of the faculty complaining because of all the extra work going into IP negotiations. But what we didn't know, I've seen statements of work. I'm not a technical type. That stuff's way over my head. So there's no way for me to know that what you're doing is development or not, unless it specifically states in there all we're doing is testing, something simple as that. As I said, we go into these relationships thinking there's going to be IP hopefully created, and we want to make sure we protect it. So that's why we added that caveat in the services agreement, where we say, okay, you own the results, but we own the IP.
But whether it's a service agreement or a research contract, the costing basis theoretically is identical, right? So how in all of this do you recover costs for facilities? Where it would seem to me in a research or service agreement, that is something that the local departments, faculty, and/or centers actually bear cost in helping to maintain and keep up through the use of funds that are other than Georgia Tech, which are not supplemented or accounted in the overhead rates by campus.
Well, what we try to do with the services agreement is we identify specifically, what equipment's going to be used. And then it's always going to cost more than what people think it does. It's always more expensive. But we take that equipment and then we will pull that out of what would be in our normal F&A. So,
I mean, do you do that on an agreement by agreement basis?
right, yeah, we would have to look and see in the services agreement exactly what's being done. But it's really up to the department to come up with that rate. We can help determine exactly what that cost is.
And
And
this is something different than a cost center. Am I understanding that
right,
correctly?
yeah.
So a question kind of following on with that, I was going to wait till later, but we have a project now like that, and like I said, we get requests a lot, especially from the companies that are in the incubator, to come in and use a piece of equipment just to test something that they developed over in the incubator, and want to use more expensive equipment here, and we don't have those prices set. So that's an example of it's defined equipment, it's in a defined space. You probably have you can calculate some hourly rate, but then we have. Dr. Joe Schmo developed an assay in his lab that companies would love to come and test their material on and just get a result. So it's not a big piece of equipment they bought, but it's probably more about time or disposables and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that respect, is it okay for them to write together a budget that they would normally put in their NIH grant, or do they need to have some sort of budget that really is an industry-focused pricing? And how do we get to that price?
Well, here again, it would just be identifying exactly, who's doing the work and what equipment's being used, and then we can always help you determine what those costs are.
So if we give you that information,
Mhm.
like we know what information to give you, and you can work with us to, because we don't want to end up putting everybody in a bad audit situation, but we just don't know. And faculty members will make up a rate whenever they usually put on their grants.
Yeah.
And that's probably been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Even with the right agreement template, the pricing is done with how they're used to pricing on a grant proposal.
Mhm.
And so what you're saying is if they're working with industry, those aren't the numbers to use, correct?
Well, they can be.
It can be, it'd be the same.
So we need to just evaluate it every time?
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
that understate inherently the value? I mean, you have the objective value, equipment, space, whatever, right? Faculty salary, but that's not really the value. The value is in the know-how and expertise in this laboratory that allows them to do whatever it is that's being done, right? And so there's an increment in that I would argue, wearing a commercial hat, industry recognizes and would be willing to pay for much more fluidly than they would the overhead rates, which.
Yeah. Well, that's like I was saying earlier. If we build up all the cost, the depreciation on the equipment and all of that, it's always usually a lot more than everybody thinks it costs.
Yeah, but I think the point is that beyond beyond the costs that are built into the F&A, beyond the cost for salaries, beyond the cost for materials and supplies, there's added value that we can build for in the intellectual know-how of the people in the area that industry is willing to pay for. And the question is, can we legitimately charge for that? I think that's
Yeah, well, we really have no way of putting a value on that. But like I'm saying earlier, if we really charge what it costs, that's a lot of people don't even want to pay that.
That's all you can do legally.
That's all we can do, yeah.
You can actually quantify an asset. So you can't do market pricing. But there might be leeway in the MTA process. I know we've done a deal where, there's a deliverable, a prototype, or a reagent or something, and there's allowable, NIH allows a certain reasonable fee associated with MTAs, and those can be high. And so I don't know how those are perceived in Georgia Tech, how those are used.
Well, keep in mind, again, that we are primarily a government contractor, and our systems are set up to comply with government regulations, including accounting. So if these are charges that the government would pay, then by all means, let's charge the companies the same thing. If these are charges that the government would throw out because they're unallowable for whatever reason, then it'd be difficult for us to, because again, our accounting system is set up to comply with the government regulations. So on another side of that, though, is I think that's a reason why some departments go with the fixed price approach, because companies are used to dealing with each other on a fixed price basis, bottom line. And you can provide the bottom line. We don't always have to provide a detailed budget to them. We can just say the cost of these testing services will be $10,000 fixed. And in the reality is it only costs you $5,000 to do it, but you kind of put some padding in there to account for these unknown costs. And then after you've paid your actual expenses, then that money can be used to offset these additional costs. That's the only other way to really do it.
However, we are still not-for-profit, so if you get to the end of that fixed price award period and you have a large residual, then it does beg the question of the profitability. The profitability question does come up by the IRS. So when you're costing, it is costing a fixed price agreement. It does make sense to build in some unknowns, but just not too many of them, because it can be problematic in other ways.
Right, but because when that fixed price agreement ends, you only have a certain period of time to spend that money.
Right.
And so theoretically, you've spent that money and costed it against that project, so you're ended up with nothing left because you don't have anything to carry over anyway.
So it goes like an unclaimed funds.
No, so basically, you just, I'm not going to say it.
Oh. I mean, it just seems to me you can use this as a tool, actually, strategically for the Institute, for things in which it wants to, beyond its public service mission, which is clear, right? But you can also use it as a tool to help strategically attract what might later on turn into be bigger, called sponsored research projects or other activities that foster and make the environment, not just at the university, but also maybe in the surrounding area, conducive to industrial partners in a different way.
And I think that was our perspective, is especially as an economic development perspective with those small companies just next door, being able to provide a service. The challenge with faculty always was, if it's a $5,000 project and takes 6 months to negotiate, no one's going to do it,
Right.
which is the easier template agreement is there. But our challenge too was our building was 100% funded with taxable revenue bonds, and we could not do anything for industry. So I think that with the service agreement, what you told me is it's still a sponsored agreement. There's still a faculty member's name tied to it.
Yes.
So from an audit perspective, it looks like it's sponsored.
Right. Yeah, because I think in this part here, so because we are able to still kind of fall within the IRS blanket, is, as I said, we have provision in the IP section that says, well, we're still going to own any IP that gets created, and we still must have the ability to publish. Those are two main requirements of the IRS, and they're stipulated in our services agreement as well. Yes, sir.
Some nonprofits have for-profit subsidiaries. That does exist out there in the world. Is that, what does that violate here?
Well, I mean, I know that I've been told that there have been times when we've actually had to pay tax on work we've done because an IRS audit has come in and found that we had done some work that wasn't compliant with the
Still
IRS.
70% ahead, so you pay tax.
but we don't do it on a regular basis. I don't know. I don't think it's ever really been looked at as creating a for-profit arm of Georgia Tech. I think we still want to maintain that public service.
Are you able to as a state entity?
Well, GTRC is technically not a state entity, so we could do an offshoot of GTRC, I believe. I don't know. Let's get into a legal area that's way above me. But I think right now we just try to really focus on our main charter.
If we could cover costs, we would be so much better.
Breaking even.
Yeah.
Let's be not for loss. That's our mantra.
And the other point there with these with using the equipment, that it never supersedes what the work that's really supposed to be done under any research work.
Right.
It would never have priority over what's already been contracted
Or
for.
on the research end, that's right.
Mhm.
Okay, so in our IP section, because there's little to no chance of IP being created, it's a very small section. The IP section in our research agreement is 2 pages. In this one, it's basically 2 small paragraphs. And then we don't mention any licensing language in there because, again, we're trying to steer away from an IP-oriented document. This is just strictly a services relationship. So we still have to allow the PI to publish, even if they don't want to. I mean, I think most of the time there are no publications issued, but the capability must still be there for us to be compliant with the IRS. And because it's test results or some kind of data, the companies still object to our publishing, but we still won't agree to any kind of limitation there. At that point, it usually takes the relationship developed by the researcher and the company to overcome that issue. So here we're talking about the 2 different types, the cost reimbursement and the fixed price. So cost reimbursement is our standard mode. It's our typical way. It's preferred because R&D is unpredictable and there's little financial risk. You know, we're getting paid as we go. And again, as I said, we're not for loss. We just want to cover our costs, and cost reimbursement is the best way to do that. One of the other things that helps with Georgia Tech is that our agreements are set up under cost reimbursement, and that we work until either the money's depleted or the time has passed, and we just stop working. A little risk to the company too, because with these monthly invoicing, they're able to compare spending with progress, and if they see things, if we're spending a lot, but they're seeing very little return as far as either monthly deliverables or informal interaction with the company, then they can terminate or slow down the spending. So it's a win-win really for both parties. Fixed price is higher risk for Georgia Tech because you have to predetermine the bottom line. And if it's $100,000, it's $100,000. And if it costs you $150,000 to do the work, you still got to do the work, and you're in the whole $50,000. And just know that the department is directly responsible to GTRC. GTRC will eat that, but they'll come after the department for that, and they do. And we talked briefly about the cost underrun. So if it only costs you $50,000 to do a $100,000 project, that looks good at first, but then that causes problems with the IRS. And you do have 12 months to spend the money.
How do you get to spend
Jim,
the
how
money? Are
do
there
you-
any constraints?
We just leave it open on the books for 12 months, for the 12-month period, and then we close it out. And there are some rules. There's the types of expenditures you can post. It has to be related program-type expenditures and things like that. But we just leave, basically, if it ends 12/31/2010, we'll leave it open for spending until the following year has passed.
And this is Jim Fortman, for those of you who don't know who he is. He's the Director of Grants and Contracts Accounting that we work very closely with. Okay, so this is our research agreement template. Just to show you, as you can see, it's in the name of the Georgia Tech Research Corporation. And then this 1.4 is where we talk about the relationship between the research corporation and the university. And as you can see, it's pretty much legalese. kind of confusing, but basically all it's saying is that we contract on behalf of the university, and that GTRC actually owns the IP. When you get hired as a university employee, part of your hiring package is you sign a document that assigns the IP you create to the research corporation, not the university, but the research corporation. Okay, so we talk about IP definitions and start and end date and dollar amounts. This is information that we get off the writing sheet, so it's important that you be as accurate as you can when you're completing the writing sheet and the statement of work. We have some leeway too on payment. A lot of companies don't want to mess with monthly invoicing, so we can actually accommodate 100% up front, which we love. And some companies do that. Or we can do 50% up front, 50% halfway, or we can do quarterly payments. So we have a lot more flexibility than, as a result of the research corporation, than the university could actually allow. So there's a benefit there. So we get their payment information, billing information. Normally we just require a final report on a project. Some companies want to stipulate more reporting, and if the research with the PI agrees to it, then that's fine with us. Publication, this is the big area for us. Again, our template here is we'll give them 30 days to review, plus an additional 30 days if they request to file a patent application. And then this right of review that the company has terminates 12 months after the end of the project. So we don't have to keep going back to them 2 or 3 years later saying, we want to publish, here's 30 days, get it back to us. After the project's done, 1 more year is all they get, and then we can publish freely. So here's the IP section. All right, first about who owns what, and then talking about the licensing. The option to an exclusive license in the field of use. We try to do a specific field of use to, again, get more flexibility for the researchers so they can do multiple exclusive licensing, the same technology but in different areas, sectors of business. Template standard is 6-month option period, and they can extend another 6 months if they upfront agree to pay for patent expenses. Then there's the internal license. Okay. As I mentioned, indemnification is an issue. It's standard with companies, but as a university, we cannot agree to indemnify another party. However, we're hypocritical, so we require them to indemnify us. And but one distinction here is that indemnity is just for their use of the IP. That's the key. Their indemnity is usually for everything that's done. Ours is limited to just IP. Okay, then we say we don't warrant or guarantee any of our work because it's R&D, because we're a state university. We limit our liability. Export's a big issue. We obviously have a lot of foreign nationals on campus, and we have to comply with U.S. export laws. So we just kind of put the companies on notice that during the project, we may have to either get a license or stop the work if there's technology that's controlled that is being used. We try and stipulate up front that we want to own the equipment that's being purchased under the project. It's always good to expand those laboratories. And then this 14.5 is where we talk about, this is the entire agreement, and that, see here, no provision, standard form, originated by the company, including a purchase order, will modify this agreement. So that's how we can allow them to issue the purchase order, but it not be the controlling document. Okay, so that's the cost reimbursement one. I'll just show you the fixed price. It's exactly the same except in the payment area. So here, our goal is to minimize our debt, so we'll try to do monthly progress payments. That's a common government term. It's not really used with companies, but we use it anyway. And some companies agree to do that. Most of them, again, either want to pay up front a portion or all of it. So we can make changes to how that money is invoiced. pretty much everything else is the same here. And I'll show you the services agreement real quick. Okay, see that? So it's
Small print.
smaller font. And no definitions here. Just go right to the term of the project and how much it's going to cost. And again, we can make changes here. One of the things that we kind of do is require an advance payment from a company. We usually do that in a situation where if we're working with a company for the first time, we'll do a Dun & Bradstreet on them. And if they're kind of a high-risk company, they're not paying their bills on time, we'll probably require an advance payment from them and still require monthly reimbursement. And the advance payment will be used to offset any possible non-payment at the back end. And that's happened. We've actually had some companies contract with us to do services. We performed the services and they walked away with the result and they never finished paying their bills. And at that point, since they had the document, we had no leverage. And we rarely go into legal action with companies. It's just not worth the bad publicity.
Is that prepayment credited towards what might be the final payment for the company?
Yeah.
You just hold
So
on
at
to
the
it
end,
and ask for-
yeah. So it'll offset the final invoice if they've been paying on time. So here's the IP section. So again, the other one was 2 pages. Here we got 2 sections. So we say they're going to receive title to whatever gets generated, but all other IP is owned by GTRC. That keeps us in good standing with the IRS. And then we kind of threw this in here too, that regardless of what we said above, if anything gets licensed to the company, then we still have an internal use of that technology.
Are there payment penalties for it not paying on time?
Yeah, so we threw this in here. We don't ever exercise it. So 1.5% fee on a monthly basis, but we'll delete that if they request it be deleted. I don't think we've ever exercised it at all. Just a scare tactic. It doesn't always work. But other than that, it's a little smaller publication section, again, because chances are there's not going to be any published, but we still give an opportunity to review before it gets published. And then this is our standard language that's in the other agreement also. But, so...
Can you add to that? I know you guys worked on something for us recently where someone from the licensing office added in some terms about material transfer because we needed to be compensated for the material, and so it required an agreement.
Right.
What about in our facility here? We have some folks, Andrew's a new person, and Nani is there, who are technicians who manage the core facilities. But if a company comes in and wants to use the facility, but we can't provide a person to do it for them, but they can be trained to use it, the language at the beginning of this seems to talk about this may be done by Georgia Tech affiliated people, but that would then be an affiliate or a scientist on site. If that may be the case in a project, can you add that language to that paragraph and then have a separate agreement signed?
Well, normally, we only want Georgia Tech employees. I think it's stipulate that here. Well, we say staff member, and their employees. So anybody with a contractual relationship with Georgia Tech would be considered a staff member and covered by the agreement.
Okay.
If they're outside of that, then we look at that on a case-by-case basis, trying to figure out a way to address it.
So we would need to notify you if in the course of a project, one of their people would be on site being trained and to use equipment.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about that, visiting scholar thing, to cover.
Can you say that again? I'm still not clear.
I'm sorry.
Say that again. This is specifically saying that the company may not provide the labor unless they're, it takes like one email to get somebody appointed as an affiliate to Georgia Tech, but you're saying that's not enough?
All I'm saying is, if they're falling within this classification,
What's the classification?
Staff member.
so they're considered a staff member. So if they're one of these things, then
If they're not that, then they can't do the actual labor associated.
Well, then we would have to address that some way. I'm just saying, either they can be part of the agreement and budgeted in the as a line item in the budget, or we have to hire them as a consultant.
Get into
It's not
liability
about, it's not about
issues.
paying them, it's really about
Liability issues.
liability issues.
Of them being on site and being hurt.
So that's also true of the research agreement then.
Oh, yeah.
The company cannot do the labor, but they can observe, but they could not. Nobody told me that.
You still have liability even if they're observing.
Well, I mean, as I said, it's very easy to get certain types of Georgia Tech appointments on
Mhm.
affiliate.
Oh, yeah.
It's no big deal. I don't really, but no, I don't know what that covers and what that does in terms of liability.
I mean, really, the way we've always looked at it is if you have to be technically an employee of Georgia Tech to be working on this project and be covered by Georgia Tech's liability umbrella of some kind.
So how does NRC then allow industry members to come in and use the facilities and pay an hourly fee?
That's pretty much how they're set up as an open source facility, that people can come in and be trained and use the equipment.
There must be some kind of waiver or something they got to sign when they do that.
I'm sure there's some sort of a liability waiver and indemnification and acceptance of liability on the company's part for any incidental, accidental, or direct issue associated with their employee. I'm sure that's part of their services agreement or something to that effect. Because companies got to be signing something.
Sure.
I know from a costing standpoint, they're set up as a cost center. So rates are pre-established and all of that structure has been put in place. But I also know that they have, for lack of better terms, walk-up services. And company XYZ can walk in and they don't set them up as an affiliate so they don't get a badge. And that's basically how they know who to charge what rate against.
Okay.
But there has to be some sort of contractual arrangement that they're using and putting in place.
And they do use a special agreement, which probably is a little more enhanced than this one,
Okay.
or more specific, but probably worth taking a look at, just to
Yeah.
make sure everything's covered.
So keep
I
in
mean,
mind.
because I think a lot of us in this room are coming from a perspective of, well, I wouldn't say a lot of us, but one in particular that I know of, is coming from a perspective of we have facilities that we don't necessarily need to or see the need to get into a cost center structured environment, but on the front end of establishing relationships, companies say either A, can you do this service for me? This is great. But more importantly, B, I'm a local company in the area, small company, even an ABTC company, and we want to gain access to your facility for a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10-hour basis. And I know that our approach is thank you, but no thank you, because we don't have a mechanism to deal with that. And, you know, we don't want to get into violation of policies and things of that nature. And that's an important needed mechanism.
Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind again is that OSP represents GTRC and combined GTRC. So if you're start talking about internal university access and use, that's legal affairs. And as a result, my expertise in this area is almost non-existent. So if it's
So would we need to have, like I've looked at that contract you sent as well, the
Visiting scholar.
visiting scholar,
yeah.
Would this contract at least need to refer to the fact that in that sentence, because that section 1.1 excludes a company person on site, but if you get a visiting scholar and legal signs off on it, then there have to be some sort of modification to that term that recognize that this, if somebody's
Well-
going to be on site from the company, a visiting scholar agreement. will
Not
be-
necessarily. So the visiting scholar agreement would address certain liability issues in access. This agreement is meant to cover the overall relationship between the company and Georgia Tech. And so when we're saying the services will be performed by staff members, it's intended to say that GTRC is going to pay the staff members to do this work from the money they're receiving from the company, and that GTRC is responsible for staff members. And So all the legal language that follows is to cover the staff member. And so this visiting scholar document is kind of a mirror document. It's parallel to it, but because they're not still a Georgia Tech employee, then they wouldn't be directly part of the agreement.
So it
That
can be done
relationship's-
two independent of each other, but as
Yeah.
long as they're both done for the time frame that they're here.
Could not the visiting scholar be tied to this as an exhibit? And then this paragraph modified just to say by staff member or visiting scholar per exhibit 1 attached or something to that effect?
Sure, but why, what is that by?
Well, because you need to add the liability aspect of things.
But we already have a liability issue covered here, and then the visiting scholar one is a different liability. Of course, then you got our
This
liability
is our
covers-
liability,
Yeah,
right? But you want to protect Georgia Tech
yeah, the university.
in the university. And I guess arguing from an industry perspective, if I've got to sign two different agreements, it then becomes more cumbersome and perhaps more objectionable. When it's all encompassed in one, I look at it and I go, oh, this is your liability, this is what I'm responsible for. Okay, I sign off on it, I'm done.
Sure.
I would agree with the last point there. It's more of it's another piece of paperwork.
Mhm.
And then the burden is on who's ever managing that project for the faculty member, whoever, to make sure that they check the box on all their pieces of paperwork. Because we don't want to do things that aren't right, but we just don't know.
Actually, do you know that on GTRC's website, there's language that talks about when non-Georgia Tech personnel are doing hands-on work in one particular lab in this building, as if that's fine to do. It gives a rule about how that has to be done.
To talk about, is it IP related or is it more?
No, just when non-Georgia Tech personnel are doing hands-on work, they have to be supervised by so-and-so. But I mean, the language is in there as if that is fine to do, as long as you have this certain stipulation of
Yeah.
supervision.
Well, my understanding is that this happens all the time. I mean, since I'm not in these facilities, I don't know what goes on. So, but yeah, I've been told it's pretty much an open door. People come in here all the time and use facilities. And because, again, it's GIT University related, legal is supposed to be the responsible entity governing that relationship. We're only involved when there's a research project being funded by a company or a services project being funded by an outside company. That's the only time OSP is involved. So I can't tell you, I mean, I know that goes on, but I'm not involved in it enough to be able to speak to it and illustrate any, ups and downs to it. I just don't know. I'm not involved. So, but I know, like I said, I guess it's been put in there because it's known to Gilda that this stuff does happen.
That it happens.
Sure.
This is a question on the pricing and service centers. If we, say, get a rate, somebody at Confocal is not a service center, but just a rate for the few times that companies come up and want service done, is there any annual reporting related to the use of that equipment because there were contracts, or is that annual reporting all tied up into just general sponsored agreements?
So the only reporting that I'm concerned with is the reporting from the service provider, internal service provider to the company. So anything beyond that, I don't know.
You're not talking about a service center?
If it's not a service center, so
Right.
there's service centers, if you go to the extent of setting up a course.
Yeah, you have to track the revenues and charges.
And you give some sort of annual reporting, but if we have the rate or utility rate set, it's not going to be a service center structure, then there's no annual obligation. Because it's like a $50,000 sort of line set that if you think your charges are going to be less than $50,000 out to industry for a piece of equipment per year, then you can just do this utility rate versus putting in a whole service center.
Right.
So I guess the question is, if you're just doing the utility rate, is there no additional annual reporting other than making sure the contract is fulfilled?
Do we do our annual validation on this?
Yeah, we would go through our revenue accounts and we would look to see if we need to come back and verify what was charged.
Maybe a request from our office to kind of validate the revenues versus expenses overall.
but nothing beyond that.
Question about equipment rental company comes to you and you have a piece of equipment which you purchased a decade ago on a contract that's long since expired, and they say, that's exactly what we need, but are you willing to rent it to us if we take it off campus? We're talking a small piece of equipment, under 10,000. How do you handle something like that?
Well, legal affairs gets involved in equipment use, so, and I think they have a template called an equipment use agreement that should govern that, and whether or not a charge is applied to that, I don't know, again, because it's an internal university procedure that my department doesn't tend to be involved in. So if there's Georgia Tech equipment that wants to be rented or used by an outside entity, then legal affairs is the department to approach to work that out. And it may end up being that it would make sense to have a services agreement issued to cover the cost associated with that use, and we can definitely then be involved in working with legal and the company to finalize that relationship.
In that particular case, how would you actually apply a cost to something that's fully depreciated, that's
Right.
not sitting on Georgia Tech property? This is a question for these guys. Not sitting on Georgia Tech property, it's fully depreciated, you got
I
no
don't think-
resources maintaining it.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah, I don't think we could apply a cost rate to that, but certainly in addition to legal affairs, capital assets accounting would be involved in determining the proper way to account for that on the state inventory and things like that. They would probably have a form or two for you to fill out.
There's an equipment loan agreement form you can use
Yeah.
and things of that nature to deal with the asset transfer aspect of it. But trying to recover cost in a nonprofit environment is, there's no cost, so there's no cost to you, so there's no cost to them.
If it's fully depreciated, then there will be no cost rate attached to that.
That was all I had to say.
Well, thank you for coming. I hope there's obviously a lot of questions, so
Well, I'm
it's been
glad.
really useful. So
I hope it has
thanks so
been.
much for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I do have one hypothetical scenario question as it relates to all this. So let's assume for a moment, in Catherine's situation, or our situation, Company A comes along and says, hey, we'd really like to use that piece of equipment over the next year for 100 hours. And it's 10 hours a week here, 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 and here. And it's going to include our employees coming on and using that piece of equipment. Let's assume for the moment we deal with the visiting scholar appropriately and the liability issue is addressed. Now, we want to apply, and I want to understand how I apply this, because this is going to be a onesie, twosie kind of an environment, not a regular thing. And in doing that, and I say, well, my actual out-of-pocket cost to maintain that equipment is, I have a technician who does preventive maintenance on it, I have an engineer who does a certain amount of setup and things of that nature for this 100-hour period, I have a certain amount of spare parts that I use for that machine every year. You guys look at it and you say, well, the depreciation on it is X per year, so that translates to X per hour. That then becomes the cost basis for the service agreement?
That's the way we would work it up, yeah.
And I mean, all of these costs, other than that particular, other than the depreciation, and other than the floor space, which carries utilities, all of those costs are costs that are not embedded in any state-paid dollars, so therefore, they're not part of campus F&A. And they're my out-of-pocket costs for those things. So the only effect, and so what you're going to do is you're going to take these two costs, the depreciation and the floor space cost, and you will then take those costs out of, for those 100 hours, out of the campus overhead.
We would have to,
Yeah, I'm
otherwise.
saying, but that's
yeah.
the backstream
Yeah.
process of this. Because if we were doing a cost center, you'd look at that across everything, and you'd pull it out of the F&A for the whole year. So you're only going to pull it out for that one incremental period of point in time.
Yeah.
That's sort of the process of how it works.
Yeah, we'd have to, otherwise we would be charging for it both ways.
Okay, I'm just trying
But
to
then-
understand the mechanisms.
Yeah. But then again, that's why we would discourage, the small dollar amount type things like that, because the accounting
The
is
accounting-
more,
the accounting
is more
mechanisms.
burdensome than what we would gain out of it, so.
Yeah.
Yes.
One last question. So is overhead ever reduced or waived for different projects?
No.
Not without
No, when-
provost approval.
Now for the real answer.
Yeah,
Uh,
good luck.
You can always ask. It's not automatic, it's case by case, and you gotta go up the chain. But especially in this current economic condition, it's hard to get a waiver, very hard. I mean, you just have to have some really good rationale.
There are even some government contracts that restrict the overhead levels, and they have to go through approval because they're much below our current F&A rate,
Which is
55, 57.
57.1
For industrial.
Industrial.
Right. And that's our true recovery of our indirect costs.
If we get a company that comes and says to us, look, we're really interested in using X facility of yours because, your rate is just so much better than I can do it elsewhere. If we know that there is a commercial provider within a reasonable range of these people, do we just tell them that that's not what we're here for and then we turn them away?
Right.
We should, especially with the Georgia company, right? We're supposed to be not competing with.
Right.
Yeah.
There's some predatory pricing laws too we have to worry
Yeah.
about.
I don't know.
But if we're charging that much less than a commercial lab, we probably haven't determined the cost properly.
Well, I mean, I know for some of our things, and Anapa had to leave, but she has a faculty rate in histology. But it is way less than what St. Joe's is charging on North Avenue. And so they're like, yeah, why wouldn't I go there? And so her perspective is, well, I probably need to have an industry rate when industry comes in. Because she's a cost center, she's had a request before, she's only charged the rate she has. And so that's probably...
It's the same with the animal facility. Our cost-based rate is still, as high as it seems, it's still way less than St. Joe's charging. And that's why people
And they're a
come to me
nonprofit
saying,
too.
That's right.
Yeah.
do this, and
Not for loss.
there's this other nonprofit, St. Joseph's nonprofit, yet their costs are still higher than our cost-based rates.
I mean, so the
Higher
other,
than our cost base rate.
Yeah.
so the other option is cost center it. Charge all your projects that cost, and then you're free to bill anybody that rate.
She's definitely a call center.
I mean, if there's a big enough market for it, and you think you can recover and service your primary mission, and that is a secondary mission. I mean, to me, that's the no-brainer.
Oddly enough, though, most of our call center rates are well below, the charge rates are well below what the cost-based rates are.
Right. That's because when you actually start looking at your cost, and you start looking at adding all the cost to it, what you have to charge is usually not industry competitive. So everybody supplements that cost with their own money in order to bring everybody else in. So,
St. Joe's is poorly managed, I guess. I don't know what's going on
well,
with them.
again, there's a difference between state institutions and private institutions. Private institutions add markup and other things to them, which we're not allowed to add.
They're in theory a nonprofit.
They're nonprofit, and they've been in the red every year since they opened.
Yeah, but
and their cost is so
being
high.
nonprofit and creating your cost base for nonprofit, how you do that are two different things, right? It depends on what they include in their nonprofit cost base.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks for coming.